Hi, I'm Marlo. And honestly, I still can't believe what happened at my sister's wedding. My grandparents handed her a $73 million gift envelope, then turned to me, laughing, "So when's your turn?" They didn't know I'd already gotten married 6 months earlier. I told them calmly, "I already had mine. You received the invitations." The whole table went silent. My grandfather insisted, "We never got anything." So I pulled out the delivery receipts, every single one signed by the same person. That's when I realized someone in my own family made sure my wedding never existed, just so my sister could claim the money that was meant for both of us. And trust me, that was only the beginning of how far they'd go to erase me. The sun dipped low over the vineyard as I stepped out of the car, my hand tucked inside my husband Oliver's arm. Sonoma County always had a way of looking cinematic, but that evening felt almost unreal. Golden light resting on rows of grapes, soft jazz floating from the courtyard, and guests dressed like they were attending a royal gala, rather than a family wedding. I smoothed the simple navy dress I'd chosen. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like me, quiet, steady, intentional. Everyone else sparkled in sequins, diamonds, and designer gowns. Oliver whispered, "You look perfect," and I gave him a small smile. I appreciated the reassurance, but the moment we crossed the stone walkway, I could already sense the imbalance. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all lit up when they saw my sister Serafina shouting her name as if she were a celebrity arriving on the red carpet. When they finally glanced my way, their greetings were polite nods, little more than air passing through. I'd grown used to being the other daughter, the one who didn't shine brightly enough to be showcased. Inside the courtyard, servers passed champagne, and violins softened the background. The ceremony began under an arch of ivory roses, and even I had to admit Serafina looked radiant. I clapped along with everyone else, even if I felt invisible in the crowd, an extra in my own family's production. After the ceremony, guests moved toward the reception tent. As Oliver and I approached the check-in table, a hostess scanned the seating chart. "Name?" she asked with a smile. "Marlo Hale," I replied. Her smile faltered as she traced the list. Yes, table 23. I knew that number was too high. When she pointed toward the back of the tent, far from the dance floor, far from the family tables, my chest tightened. Table 23 was labeled Friends, Plus Ones, and Miscellaneous. I blinked. Miscellaneous. Meanwhile, the table closest to the stage had a neatly printed sign, Immediate Family Only, with every seat filled. I caught sight of my mother, Vivian, glancing over. The moment our eyes met, she turned away and pretended to fix her hair. A soft warning rose in my mind. They made room for everyone. Except me. Oliver squeezed my hand, sensing my reaction, but I told him quietly, "It's fine. Let's just sit." Dinner began with toasts, jokes, and stories about how perfect Serafina had always been. Then my grandparents stood, holding a velvet-lined box. My grandfather tapped a spoon to his glass. "Family," he announced proudly. "Tonight we honor tradition." People leaned in, eager. "This," he continued, drawing out a thick envelope sealed with gold wax, "represents legacy, our gift to Serafina and Daniel as they start their life together." The hostess lifted the microphone closer as they revealed the amount. $73 million. Gasps scattered through the room. Phones lifted, flashes burst like tiny explosions. Serafina pressed a hand to her chest in dramatic disbelief. Daniel kissed her cheek while everyone applauded. I clapped too, but inside, something twisted painfully, a familiar old ache of being unseen. The applause faded and guests settled. That's when my grandmother turned toward me, smiling a little too brightly. "She's such a beautiful bride, Marlo. So, when's your turn? Laughter rippled around the table, the kind that said, "We're only teasing. Don't make it weird." My mind went blank. For a moment, I stared at her, swallowing the sting. They weren't teasing. They were exposing a wound they believed still existed. They were declaring, publicly, that I'd never been chosen. Heat climbed up my neck. I had a choice: shrink back, laugh it off, or finally speak the truth they'd buried. I set down my champagne. "I already had mine," I said softly. The laughter thinned. "6 months ago, you received the invitations." The entire table froze. Even the band seemed to quiet. Grandfather frowned, confused. "We never got them." My pulse thudded in my ears, but my voice stayed steady. I reached for my clutch, resting beside my plate. "Marlo," Oliver murmured, but I shook my head. Enough years had passed with me staying silent. The air shifted as I unfastened the clasp. Guests watched with growing curiosity, Serafina's practiced smile beginning to crack. My mother's fingers tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles whitened. I pulled out the thin stack I'd brought with me, not because I planned a confrontation, but because I'd learned long ago that proof is sometimes the only language my family respects. I laid the papers onto the linen tablecloth, their corners brushing the silver cutlery. "And when I placed those 4 delivery receipts in front of them," I whispered, "every signature pointed to the same person." I didn't lift my gaze from the 4 receipts resting between the plates and wine glasses. I didn't need to. The shift in the air told me everything. The chatter thinning into uneasy whispers, the clinking of silverware fading as people tried to pretend they weren't listening. Serafina's glamorous vineyard wedding suddenly felt colder, as if someone had opened a hidden door and let reality sweep in. Dad cleared his throat with that rehearsed gentleness he always used when trying to steer a situation back under control. "Marlo, there must be some mistake." There it was, the same script they had used my entire life. Something hurtful happens, and somehow I'm the one misunderstanding it. The ache in my chest resurfaced, but it wasn't sharp this time. More like touching an old bruise, still tender, but familiar enough that it no longer stole my breath. Across the table, Serafina kept her practiced smile, but a small twitch pulled at her jawline. Her fingers tightened around her champagne flute, knuckles whitening as if she wished she could shatter the glass instead of looking at me. I leaned back slowly, letting my breathing steady. "There's no mistake." Mom opened her mouth, no doubt ready to deliver the soft, dismissive tone she had perfected over 3 decades. But before she could speak, a server carrying a tray brushed accidentally against her chair. Mom jolted violently, far more than the slight nudge warranted. For a brief second, her mask cracked, showing something raw beneath. I caught her expression, and she knew I caught it. As the receipts lay on the table, a memory floated up, one that had never fully settled because it didn't fit anywhere until now. 4 months earlier, my grandmother had called me unexpectedly. She rarely called me directly. Usually, my mother or Serafina relayed any message like I was some distant relative, not her granddaughter. That day, her tone was gentle but unmistakably confused. "Sweetheart, didn't you tell us you were still figuring out your wedding date? Serafina said you planned to wait until next year." I remember pausing, forcing a small laugh, thinking maybe she'd misheard something, but she hadn't misunderstood. Someone else had rewritten the details of my life. And tonight, that odd conversation snapped perfectly into place. Someone had fed her a different version of me, one where I was perpetually waiting, never committed, always second. Only one person consistently rearranged my life narrative to fit her spotlight. 2 months before my wedding, Serafina had texted me something overly sweet. "Hey sis, hope you're doing okay. Wedding planning is wild. Sorry if we seem distant." I remember reading it twice, puzzled by why she sounded like she was consoling me for something I wasn't struggling with. Oliver and I had planned our ceremony with ease. It was small, heartfelt, exactly what we wanted, but the text wasn't comfort. It was camouflage, a preemptive apology for a guilt she had no intention of sitting with, a gentle cushion she placed between her actions and her conscience. Only now, staring at these 4 receipts, did the truth surface. She had already started erasing me before my wedding even happened. Back at the table, Grandpa reached forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted one of the receipts. His voice, usually steady and commanding, broke into a whisper. "Who signed these?" I touched the signatures lightly. "You already know." Mom's face drained of color. Dad's jaw clenched hard enough that a muscle pulsed beside his ear. Serafina looked as if she wanted to dissolve into the rhinestones of her $24,000 gown. Inside me, something shifted, quiet, powerful. I wasn't the daughter swallowing humiliation to keep peace anymore. I wasn't the silent presence trailing behind the golden child. Tonight, I was naming the truth. Even if my voice trembled, it was still mine. Dad tried again, softer this time, as if lowering his volume would lower the tension. "Marlo, can we talk about this privately?" "No," I replied, calm but unwavering. "Because it didn't happen privately." His expression faltered. He wasn't angry, he was startled. The daughter he counted on to keep the peace had stopped playing her part. Mom extended her hand as though she meant to touch my arm, then froze when she realized I wasn't moving toward her. "You're misunderstanding," she began. "I'm not," I said, cutting gently through her lie. "But we can go over every detail if you'd like, because I remember everyone." Serafina leaned forward slightly, her voice strained. "Can we just enjoy the wedding?" I looked her directly in the eye, not with bitterness, but with clarity. This is me enjoying the truth. Her flinch was small but unmistakable. The candles around us flickered as the breeze from the terrace drifted into the tent, carrying the scent of wine and late autumn air. I inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle into me. I realized then I didn't need their confession tonight. The truth had already escaped the cage they'd built for it. For years, I had carried the weight of their version of me, quiet, overlooked, easily overwritten. But the moment I placed those receipts on the table, that weight shifted off my shoulders and onto theirs. And it wasn't going back. Mom leaned closer, her smile tight and brittle. "Marlo, stop before you embarrass yourself." I turned my head toward her, speaking softly enough that only our table could hear. "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed." Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Just then, my phone buzzed inside my clutch. I instinctively reached for it, unsure why a 3-month-old notification had resurfaced, until I saw the message appear across my lock screen, synced from cloud storage. "You have been removed from family group chat." The timestamp was unmistakable. It was the exact week I mailed the wedding invitations. A slow, cold understanding settled over me. They hadn't forgotten my wedding. They had made a coordinated choice to erase me. I didn't breathe for a moment after that realization hit me. The vineyard lights blurred at the edges of my vision, not because I was emotional, but because my mind was moving too quickly, sorting through memories, rearranging them, pulling old moments into a new shape that finally made sense. I opened the notification fully, and there it was, removed by Mom. The words sat on the screen like a bruise I hadn't noticed forming. I had always thought she tiptoed around conflict, that her silence was meant to keep the peace. But seeing her name beside that action felt like a hand closing quietly around my throat. It wasn't Serafina. It wasn't Dad. It was the person who always smiled gently and said, "Honey, I'm doing my best." My mind flew back to last June. the summer I'd mistaken for chaotic but harmless. I remembered stopping by their house after choosing my wedding venue. I was still flushed from excitement, carrying brochures from the vineyard, the same kind of place we were sitting in tonight. Mom stood in the kitchen, piping frosting onto cupcakes for one of Serafina's endless pre-wedding events. I had told her, I put down the deposit today, almost glowing with pride. She didn't look up, just a quiet, distracted, "That's nice, sweetheart," like I'd mentioned buying new towels. Back then it stung, but I told myself she was overwhelmed. Standing here now, the truth came back with a different weight. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was uninterested, by choice. A second memory pushed forward, sharper. The week I mailed out my invitations, I had also handed Mom a stack to give to a few older relatives who preferred hand delivery. She had smiled warmly and said she'd take care of it at Sunday dinner. But 2 weeks later, Aunt Lila called asking if she should expect something in the mail. I had laughed it off, promising it was probably just delayed. Now I could see the truth without squinting. Mom never delivered them. She never meant to. She let my invitations sit somewhere, maybe in a drawer, maybe in a trash bag, while she coordinated floral samples for Serafina's bridal luncheon. A knot tightened in my chest as another moment resurfaced. It was June 20th. I had stopped by the house unexpectedly to drop off the tasting menu for my reception. When I walked inside, I froze. Mom, Dad, Serafina, and her fiancé were sitting at the dining table surrounded by piles of envelopes. They all went still when they saw me, not surprised, not casual, caught. Mom chirped an overly bright explanation about helping Serafina with rehearsal dinner invites. But the envelopes in front of them weren't hers. They were mine. My cream envelopes, my return address, my handwriting. I remembered how Serafina had slid her hand over the stack closest to her and muttered, "Mom, hide those." At the time, I thought I misread something. Tonight, it felt crystal clear. They hadn't misplaced my invitations. They had intercepted them. Intentionally. The vineyard's golden lights snapped me back into the present. The room was still bustling, music flowing, laughter spilling from the dance floor. But at our table, a frost had settled. I could feel Mom's eyes on me before I even lifted my head. When I finally met her gaze, she flinched. "Why did you remove me from the family chat?" I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Her fork slipped and hit the plate with a sharp clang. Dad straightened. Serafina's face drained of color beneath her expensive makeup. "You're reading too much into this," Mom whispered. "No," I replied softly. "I'm finally reading it correctly." Another flash of memory hit me, one I hadn't let myself examine closely. That week after they removed me from the chat, I sent a picture of my wedding dress to the group without realizing I was no longer in it. When no one responded, I assumed everyone was busy, but the photo had never reached them. I had been talking into an empty room, thinking my family was simply distracted. The reality was far colder. They'd closed the door and turned off the lights behind me. I could see the facade cracking across the table. Mom's lips trembled. Dad's jaw tightened. Serafina straightened her shoulders like she was fighting to keep her crown from slipping. "Marlo, sweetheart," Dad murmured. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I answered, surprising even myself with how steady I sounded. "A wedding is where this began." Serafina finally snapped, the sweetness gone. "You're making a scene at my wedding." I turned to her calmly. "I'm acknowledging my own." That was when Grandpa, who had been watching everything unfold with widening eyes, looked straight at my mother. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't scold, but the weight behind his question was enough to make the entire table freeze. "Linda, where are Marlo's missing invitations?" Mom's face went ghost white, and in that instant, I felt it. The shift in the entire evening. Something had cracked open, and nothing was going back to the way it was. Grandpa's questions still vibrated in the air, sharp enough to cut through the music drifting from the dance floor. Mom didn't answer. She just stared at him with a stiffness that told me she was calculating, desperate to gather the pieces before they scattered. But it was too late. The shape of the truth had already taken form. As I watched her, I felt a light tap on my shoulder. I turned, startled out of the tension for half a second. Mrs. Alden, our family's lavender-scented neighbor who'd known me since kindergarten, stood there holding a tiny plate of lemon bars. "Honey," she murmured, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a harmless little update. "I hope everything worked out with your wedding planner after the change your mother requested." It was as if every sound around us dimmed. I blinked once, slowly. "What change?" Her smile faltered. She glanced at the table, at my mother's rigid expression, at Dad's slumped shoulders, then back at me. "Oh dear, I thought you knew. Your mom asked the planners to pause everything because the family wasn't ready for another wedding." Serafina gasped softly, offended by the phrasing. "Another?" Mrs. Alden stammered, visibly panicking. "I only meant, well, your mother said it would be better for the family if things waited until after your big day, sweetheart." Dad exhaled through his nose, long and slow. Grandma closed her eyes. Grandpa looked like someone had just cracked his cane over his heart. Inside me, something slid into place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition, pure and cold. I turned to Dad. "Did you know about this?" He didn't look at me, didn't swallow, didn't blink. That silence, thick and cowardly, was its own kind of confession. My voice dropped, hurting more than it shook. "You knew." His jaw twitched. Just once. Enough. Mom snapped, "Michael, don't." But he lifted his hand to stop her, still refusing to meet my eyes. And in that single gesture, I realized something I had spent 30 years avoiding. My father was not powerless. He was complicit. He chose convenience over loyalty, silence over fairness, Serafina over me. It settled into me with a quiet finality that felt like ice. Serafina rose from her chair abruptly, her hands planted on her hips, her voice sharp with indignation. "Why is this suddenly about you?" I didn't move. I didn't raise my tone. "Because someone made sure my wedding never happened the way I planned, and now we all know who." Her expression twisted in disbelief. "You're jealous." Grandpa's palm hit the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "Enough." Even the DJ's playlist seemed to falter. "This isn't jealousy," he said, eyes locked on Mom. "This is deceit." Mom's veneer cracked. "I did what I had to do to protect our family image." I leaned back, letting the words sit between us. "There it is." She squared her shoulders, gripping her napkin as if it could anchor her. "You were rushing into marriage. You didn't think it through." "The timing," I interrupted slowly. "Or the money." Her mouth snapped shut. Dad flinched. A subtle movement, but obvious once you knew where to look. I turned to Grandpa, feeling the tension coil tighter. "You know why, don't you?" He swallowed, old eyes full of something like regret. "Your mother, she told us things were complicated." "What things?" I pressed. Grandma reached for his arm. "Gerald, not here." But he shook her off gently. "No, it's time." Mom's voice cracked like a whip. "Dad, stop." He didn't. He looked at me directly. "Your mother told us you weren't sure about your relationship, that you told her you were having doubts." A sting hit my chest. I looked at Mom. She didn't deny it. She didn't blink. She simply braced for the fallout. "She said you told her you weren't ready for marriage." I shook my head slowly. "I never said that." Mom's voice rose an octave. "You were confused, emotional. I was in love, I replied, and you were confused about losing control. The words seemed to knock the wind out of her. She pushed back from the table and stood abruptly, her linen napkin slipping to the floor. You don't understand how much pressure I was under. I kept this family running. I cut in softly. Where was that devotion when I stood alone at my ceremony rehearsal? Her breath hitched. Dad finally lifted his eyes to mine. His voice was quiet, but the damage it delivered was catastrophic. Your mother didn't want 2 weddings the same year. She thought people would compare them. And Serafina deserved her moment. The air vanished from my lungs. Mom covered her mouth. Grandma whispered something under her breath. Serafina blinked rapidly, trying to decide whether to be offended or relieved. Grandpa's face hardened with disappointment so raw it felt like a second slap. You canceled my invitations, I said slowly, because you didn't want my wedding to steal the spotlight? Dad didn't look away. She said it was better for the family. And with that one sentence, everything inside me went cold enough to burn. The moment Grandpa demanded to know what else they'd kept from him, the entire reception shifted. The string quartet faltered, conversations died mid-sentence, and even the waitstaff paused like someone had pulled the plug on the room's electricity. I stayed perfectly still. My calmness wasn't an accident. After a lifetime of being talked over, dismissed, and told to be reasonable, I finally understood the power of silence. Especially mine. Mom tried to recover first. She lifted her chin, adjusted her bracelet, and forced a brittle smile. "We are not doing this here," she muttered. I gave a small, controlled smile. "Actually, this is exactly where it should happen." She narrowed her eyes as if she could stare me back into the obedient daughter she preferred. Dad leaned forward and whispered my name, a warning coated in fear. I almost felt sorry for him, almost, but the sympathy evaporated the moment I remembered how easily he'd gone along with everything. "I won't hold my tongue anymore," I told him. The tremor that ran through both my parents wasn't anger. It was dread. I reached for my phone, scrolled to the document I'd found 2 nights earlier, and handed it to Grandpa. His brows drew together as he read. The color drained from his face. Then he whispered the number aloud, 82,400, as if saying it made the betrayal real. Mom exhaled sharply. Serafina froze, mascara smudging under her eyes. Dad closed his own like the truth burned. "You moved money from my account," I said quietly. "The money you promised was for my wedding." The planner standing near the cake display actually gasped. She must have recognized the transaction memo. Serafina shook her head in disbelief. "Mom, you told me you and Dad saved extra because you wanted my day to be perfect. You never said it wasn't yours to spend," Mom snapped, "because you deserved something elegant, something people wouldn't forget." The words tumbled out, desperate and unfiltered. We couldn't fund both weddings the same year. We had to be practical. Practical? That stung more than anything, because it was so honest. They hadn't chosen what was right. They'd chosen what was convenient. Dad suddenly stood, chair scraping against the floor. The room jumped. "Linda, stop pretending," he said, voice low but firm. I had never heard him sound like that. "You kept pushing and pushing. First it was the invitations, then the planner, then the money. And every time I said no, you gave me another reason why Marlowe's wedding could wait." Mom spun toward him, stunned he dared contradict her in public. "You're twisting things." He shook his head. "I'm admitting them. There's a difference." The words trembled, but they were genuine. "You forced me to keep choosing the easy way instead of the honest one." I rose slowly, smoothing my dress. "This is the last time," told both of them, "that I let you decide what I should accept." Mom let out a breathy, disbelieving laugh. A warning? From you? Yes, I said. A very clear one. My voice stayed level. If you interfere in my life again, my relationship, my wedding, my future, you won't like the consequences. Dad whispered my name again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was regret. I didn't let it sway me. You took more than money, I continued. You took moments I can never get back. And you hid behind the idea that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you felt like giving. Grandpa leaned back, watching my parents with a sorrow that cut deeper than anger. Mom pressed her lips together, trying to hold the facade. Serafina, meanwhile, looked ready to faint. She reached out toward me, voice breaking. Marlo, what are you planning to do? Her fear was raw, real, and new. She'd never been afraid of me before. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I asked, "Where's my wedding album?" The question sliced through the tension like a blade. She blinked. What do you mean? The photos you promised you'd send, I reminded her. After your honeymoon. Her hand dropped to her side. The color drained from her face. Mom stiffened. Dad looked away. That was all the confirmation I needed. My album hadn't vanished. It hadn't been delayed. It hadn't been misplaced. Someone had made sure I never saw it. And now the very people who orchestrated everything were sitting in front of me with no place left to hide. The warning I'd given them wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The moment I told them I would find the answers myself, tension rippled across the table like unseen static. The wedding chatter around us kept going, cutlery tapping, champagne bubbling, guests laughing in distant pockets. But at our end, everything felt suspended. Mom's fingers clenched around her napkin. Dad's breathing grew shallow. Serafina looked like her entire world tilted sideways. And for the first time tonight, I felt my footing completely steady. I reached for my phone, ignoring Mom's exasperated sigh. Oh, please, she muttered. Must you keep making a scene? I kept my voice calm. I'm not making a scene, I'm making progress. My thumb tapped a familiar contact. The reaction was instant. Mom stiffened like I'd grabbed a live wire. Dad shot upright. Even Serafina whispered, barely audible, Marlo, don't do this. But I had already pressed the call. Jacob picked up on the first ring, cheerful as always. Hey, I wondered when you'd call. I switched to speaker. Jacob, can you repeat what you told me last week? He didn't hesitate. About your mom paying me to delete your wedding photos? The hall wasn't silent before, but it was now. I could feel the shift, like everyone nearby suddenly forgot how to breathe. Jacob continued casually, oblivious to the dozens of eyes swinging toward us. She said your album didn't look good enough, and it'd be better for the family image if I put more time into Serafina's engagement shoot. Honestly, I felt awful, but she insisted and, well, she did offer an extra $500. Grandpa muttered something under his breath, low and furious. Grandma's hand shook so hard her water glass rattled. Serafina stared at Mom in disbelief. You destroyed her wedding photos? She whispered. Mom's expression contorted, anger, embarrassment, panic all colliding. Dad's voice broke. Linda, tell me none of this is true. But she said nothing, and her silence was louder than any denial. I ended the call. Mom pushed back her chair. You had no right to drag him into this, she hissed. This is family business. Exactly, I replied. So was my wedding. Serafina clutched her mother's arm. How could you do something like that? I told you to stay out of her plans. Mom yanked her arm away. I did what I had to do. Her marriage was a disaster waiting to happen. I was trying to keep this family from falling apart. Grandpa slammed a hand on the table so hard the nearby candles flickered. Destroying her memories? Throwing away her invitations? Sabotaging her day? That's your idea of keeping this family together? Mom snapped. The pressure finally cracked whatever mask she was clinging to. Her voice rose, sharp and brittle. I intercepted her invitations because half the people on her list don't even like him. And I wasn't about to let them judge us when the whole thing was rushed and messy. Dad turned toward her slowly, like he couldn't trust his own ears. You told me the mailroom misplaced the boxes. Mom shrugged, defiant, bitter. I told you what you needed to hear. Serafina covered her face, mortified. Mom, you threw them away? All of them? Mom's voice sharpened further. Your sister rushes into decisions. She needed time to grow up, to think, to understand that not every relationship is worth celebrating. I wasn't going to let our relatives send her gifts she'd waste. That did it. The heat inside my chest didn't explode. It focused, concentrated like a flame shaped into a blade. I stood, steady as stone. You didn't do this to help me, I said quietly. You did it to control me. Mom shook her head, but the conviction in her eyes was faltering. You always twist everything. No, I replied. For once, I'm calling everything what it actually is. Grandpa rose beside me, his jaw tight. Marlo, he said, voice rough. What happens now? I looked directly at both my parents, and for the first time I saw fear. Not annoyance, not irritation, real fear. They had spent years believing I would always stay small, quiet, agreeable. That their decisions would shape my life because I would never challenge them. That version of me no longer existed. Tonight, I said, is step one. Mom swallowed hard. Step one of what? Of taking back everything you thought you could erase. Dad whispered my name, but I lifted a hand gently. You won't stop me this time, I said. None of you. Serafina's voice cracked. Marlo, what are you going to do? I gave her a small, controlled smile, the first real smile I'd allowed myself all night. The one thing none of you prepared for. Mom's lips tightened. And what exactly is that? I held her gaze. Telling the truth, all of it. Every last piece you tried so hard to bury. Her expression changed. Not anger, not denial, something far more revealing. Fear of the truth finally reaching daylight. And that was when I knew. My first strike had landed exactly where it needed to. The moment I said I was coming for the truth, they buried. The temperature in the ballroom shifted. It wasn't the air conditioning. This was something heavier, something human. The chandelier above our table flickered once, as if the building itself braced for what was about to happen. Mom's posture tightened. Dad looked like someone had removed all the bones holding him upright. And Serafina, her eyes reflected a kind of dread I'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't innocence. It was the fear of someone who knew the tide had finally turned. Mom recovered first. She always did. Her voice shot through the room, sharp and trembling. Enough, she snapped, grabbing the edge of the table as if she needed it to stay standing. You think you're the only one with something to say? You think you're some perfect little angel? Tell them, Sarah. Go ahead. Tell them what you told me. Serafina's breath caught. I turned toward her slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal. Careful but not blind. Tell them what? Mom pushed her forward by the arm, desperate. Tell them you said your sister ruins every event. Tell them you said her wedding wasn't worth attending. Tell them she's always been jealous. Stop! Serafina's voice cracked through the room like breaking glass. Every conversation in the ballroom fell silent. She looked at me with pure panic. Marlo, I didn't mean... But her expression gave her away. She had said it. Maybe not with intention, but she said it. And it stung. Not because I believed it, but because she knew it wasn't true and said it anyway. I stepped closer, Not threatening, just clearer. You knew, I whispered. She shook her head too fast. I didn't know everything, just that Mom didn't want him there. She said Grandpa would be embarrassed. She said, "So you agreed to let her get rid of my invitations?" I asked. Her lips trembled. I didn't think she'd throw them away. I thought she'd delay them or hold the packages. I didn't think she'd destroy them. But you knew, I said again, softer. You knew it would hurt me, and you let it happen because it made your own plans easier. Tears spilled down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. But she had. Intentional or not, complicity was still complicity. Grandpa pressed a hand to his chest. Serafina, you sided with them? She crumpled inward. I just wanted my wedding to be perfect. I held her gaze. And mine? Did it matter at all? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Mom sensed the room turning against her and shifted gears instantly, something she'd done all my life. Her voice softened, trembling with an artificial gentleness she used whenever she wanted control. Marlo, sweetheart, let's step outside and talk. You're emotional. You're overwhelmed. I let out a low, humorless laugh. You've never wanted a conversation. You've only ever wanted obedience. Her eyes chilled instantly. You don't intimidate me. I leaned in the slightest bit. You should be cautious, very cautious. Her breath caught. Dad mumbled, "Please don't tear the family apart." I whipped my attention to him. I didn't tear anything. You watched Mom swing the hammer. Mom grabbed his hand, squeezing. She's trying to destroy everything we built. You need to stand up for us, Michael. Say something. Dad stayed still, eyes on the floor. Mom's voice rose, desperate. Michael! And then he whispered, the smallest, most fragile truth I'd ever heard him say. I can't protect you anymore. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was explosive. Hidden detonations finally breaking open. Mom stumbled back, shock twisting her expression. That was my cue. I reached into my bag and lifted a thin black folder. Mom's complexion turned gray. "No," she whispered. "Marlo, no, you didn't." I opened the folder. I said I was coming for the truth. I slid the first page onto the table, an email printout. To momemail.com. Subject, hold all incoming packages. Body, don't release anything addressed to Marlo Turner. I'll pick them up myself. Time stamped 3 days before my invitations shipped. The guests closest to us gasped softly. I laid down another. To weddingvendoremail.com. Instructions to cancel the floral arch, cancel aisle decor, downgrade to minimal arrangements. Do not inform Marlo. She thinks everything is still on track. Mom reached for the pages, but I tapped her hand before she could grab them. We're not finished. Another page. From Mom to Serafina. She can't get Grandma and Grandpa's blessing yet. She's too unstable. Let me manage the guest list. Don't tell her you saw her ex. Serafina shook her head violently. That's not what I meant. Mom twisted everything I said. Mom slammed her hand down. Those emails are out of context. Grandpa broke. Linda, this is cruelty. You destroyed her wedding. Mom barked. I was protecting this family. And I replied, steady and calm, you were protecting your favoritism. Voices around us sharpened. Someone near the dessert table muttered, I can't believe she'd do this to her own daughter. Another said, no wonder the inheritance is a mess. A third whispered, poor girl. Mom spun toward them, enraged. Stop talking about us. But control had slipped right out of her reach. Grandma's eyes glistened. We raised her better than this, she whispered to Grandpa. He turned back to me. Marlo, what do you want us to do? All eyes landed on me again. Mom's trembling, Dad's defeated, Serafina's broken. This time I didn't shrink. I didn't fold. I didn't give them the version of me they were used to. "I don't want revenge," I said, my voice steady. Mom scoffed. Under her breath. "Of course you don't. I want accountability." Grandpa nodded, slow but certain. "And you'll have it." Mom panicked. "Dad, no, no, you can't take her side." He didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. "The more you bury the truth," he said, "the more we will demand it." Mom froze, the realization washing over her like cold water. Control was gone. Power was gone. And for the first time in my life, the room wasn't listening to her voice. They were listening to mine. The shift was final, and everyone knew it. The moment my mother's knees buckled, the entire ballroom shifted. It no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like Judgment Day dressed in candlelight and linen tablecloths. Conversations dimmed to a hush. Champagne flutes were set down quietly. Even the chandeliers above stopped swaying, as if the whole room was holding its breath while I placed the final email log face down on the table. I watched Mom's trembling fingers hover in the air, desperate to grab the paper before anyone else could. She didn't dare. Not tonight. Not after what had already come spilling out. I laid the document flat, my voice steady and sharp. "You forged my signature." A ripple went through the room like a cold breeze. Someone gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my goodness," under their breath. Grandpa leaned in, inspecting the form with eyes that had signed more contracts than any man at this table. "This isn't her handwriting," he said, his voice thick with anger. Mom stumbled back a step. Dad clutched the edge of his chair. Serafina's bouquet slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud no one missed. I kept my gaze steady. "You used my identity to access my accounts. You used it to cancel vendors, redirect payments, sign for packages that weren't yours. You needed my signature, so you made one up." Mom's lips twitched as if she were searching for a lie, but nothing came. Her voice broke instead. "It's not what it looks like." I tilted my head. "It looks like fraud." Before she could gather another excuse, I spoke again, deliberate. "And I wouldn't have understood the entire picture if I hadn't gone into the basement last night." Mom's whole body jerked like someone had pulled a hidden string. Dad whispered, "You went where?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Dad. I went into the storage room, the one she keeps locked with that old brass key she wears like jewelry." Mom clutched at her necklace on instinct, as if the key might still be hanging there. It wasn't. I'd taken it from her coat pocket the night before. "Stop," she breathed, voice shaking. "Stop, Marlo." I ignored the plea and lifted the wooden box from my bag, placing it in the center of the table. The room seemed to shrink around us when everyone recognized the sound of the latch clicking open. Inside, illuminated by the golden glow of the wedding lights, lay the pieces of the life she'd tried to erase. Shredded wedding invitations, mine, folded vendor cancellations, RSVP lists covered in red ink, postage slips with her name signed across every line. A half-burned copy of my ceremony script rested on top, its edges charred. Gasps erupted like popcorn across the room. Grandma pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Dad stared at the box as though he were looking at a crime scene. "Linda, how could you?" he whispered, and for once, there was no anger in his voice, just disbelief. Mom reached toward the box like she might snatch it back, but I shut it gently, my palm firm on the lid. "You tried to erase my wedding," I said quietly. "But you forgot something. I save everything." Then I pulled out the final document, the one that mattered more than anything else. A delivery receipt, time-stamped, dated, and addressed not to me, but to my grandparents' house, their gift package, the one that never reached them. I turned it so Grandpa could see it clearly. His breath shook as he leaned closer. "I never got this package," he said, genuinely stunned. "I never signed for it." "You didn't have to," I replied. "She did." I turned the paper over, and there it was, her signature, clear as day. Received by Linda Turner. A silence so deep fell over the ballroom that even the band at the far end stopped mid-song. Grandma began crying quietly. Grandpa's hands trembled as he traced the signature with his thumb. "She took your invitations," he whispered, his voice breaking. "So we wouldn't come, so we couldn't give you the gift we prepared." Mom tried to speak, something, anything, but the truth came spilling out of her in the worst way possible. "It was for Serafina," she cried, her voice raw. "She deserved the money. You would have wasted it. She needed it. You didn't." The guests recoiled like they'd been slapped. Even Serafina stared at her with horror. "Mom, you sabotaged her wedding for money?" Mom didn't deny it, didn't flinch. She shouted, "Yes!" The room dissolved into stunned whispers. Grandpa rose so quickly his chair slammed into the floor behind him. His voice thundered across the hall. "You stole $73 million from her future." Mom shook her head violently. "It wasn't stealing." "You robbed her of her moment," Grandpa shouted. "Her milestone, her chance to start a life with her husband. You took everything from her." Grandma sobbed into her napkin, the sound fragile and heartbreaking. "We trusted you," she whispered. "We trusted you, Linda, and you destroyed her with your selfishness." Mom dropped back into her chair, her shoulders shaking. Dad covered his face with both hands. Serafina stood frozen, mascara streaking down her cheeks, finally seeing the true cost of all the help she'd received. Grandpa turned toward me again, and his voice softened, but held the weight of a final verdict. "Marlo, this will be fixed. Every part of it." Grandma nodded, eyes red. "You will receive everything that was taken from you, everything you earned, everything you deserved." My throat tightened, but not from sadness, more from the surreal relief of finally being seen. "And as for them," Grandpa continued, looking at my parents with an icy calm that silenced even the whispers. Mom straightened, panic flashing. Grandpa didn't blink. "They will face consequences." Mom inhaled sharply, her breath rattling. Dad lowered his, hands staring at the table, hollow. He murmured, "Linda, what have we done?" I exhaled slowly, feeling something lift off my shoulders, something heavy and suffocating that had lived there for years. The truth was out, completely, permanently. They could never reshape it, never twist it, never bury it again. Tonight was the night everything they built finally collapsed. And it collapsed under the weight of their own lies. Grandpa's questions still rang in my ears long after the ballroom lights dimmed and guests drifted out in stunned silence. "What do you want to happen next?" I didn't answer him then, not with dozens of eyes waiting to see whether I'd choose revenge or mercy. Instead, I simply stepped back from the table, feeling every muscle in my body pulsing with the weight of the night, and walked away. The cool air outside hit me like a release. For the first time in forever, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt steady. I barely slept once I got home, not because of fear, because my mind was finally clearing after years of fog. My phone buzzed nonstop across the nightstand, lighting up the dark bedroom. Serafina sent long messages that swung between excuses and confusion. Dad left 3 voicemails, each one softer than the last. Mom sent fragmented texts, accusations, pleas, half-written sentences that sounded like someone scrambling to rewrite a story already carved in stone. I let every message sit untouched. The silence I returned to them wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary long overdue. Morning drifted in through the windows of my small Seattle house, washing the living room in a pale gray glow. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet I used to resent because it made me feel isolated. But today, it felt like a clean page. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and let the steam brush my face as thoughts settled into place. No more shrinking myself just to keep peace in a home that never felt like mine. No more pretending their treatment was normal. No more swallowing hurt just so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable. By midday, Grandpa called. His number lighting up my phone brought a tightness to my chest. I braced myself for disappointment, for a lecture, for anything resembling the conversations of the past. But when I answered, his voice was unsteady. "Marlo, I'm ashamed, deeply. We should have protected you." I leaned against the porch railing, listening as he explained everything unraveling on their end. The $73 million fund? Frozen immediately. Mom had apparently broken down in front of them, crying, shouting, claiming I'd ruined the family reputation. Dad left the house not long after the guests did, unable to face her. Serafina refused to come out of the guest room. It didn't shock me. The house always fell apart the second someone stopped pretending. What did surprise me was Grandpa's next words. "We'd like to see you, alone, no one else." I agreed, though my stomach tightened at the thought of walking back into their home after everything that happened. That evening, the drive through their quiet neighborhood felt surreal, like retracing steps into a childhood I'd spent years trying to survive. When Grandma opened the front door, she didn't hesitate. She pulled me into a long, trembling embrace. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "We believed what we wanted to believe. We looked away when we shouldn't have. That won't happen again." She led me into the dining room. A folder sat neatly at the center of the polished table, my name printed across the front in bold lettering. I eased into the chair as Grandpa opened it and slid the document toward me. A new trust, separate, protected, mine. No strings attached, no comparisons, no expectations that I stay silent or grateful or small. "This is for your future," Grandpa said, his voice low and sincere. "For the life you want to build, not the one anyone else forces on you." That was the moment the knot in my chest finally loosened. I didn't cry last night at the wedding, not when Mom denied everything, not when Serafina stared at me as though I had betrayed her. But in that dining room, with two people finally choosing truth over appearances, the tears came. Not for the money, but because I was finally seen. A few days later, Dad showed up unexpectedly at my door. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hallway, and he looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "I should have stopped her," he said quietly. "I should have asked questions. I should have been better." He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't defending her. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was the closest he had ever come to taking responsibility. And I accepted it, not as a reconciliation, but as closure, a weight shifting off my shoulders. Mom never called again, not a text, not a note slipped under my door, nothing. Her silence, after years of demanding mine, was the clearest truth she'd ever given me. The kind of truth you don't fight. You simply accept it as the final puzzle piece. On Sunday morning, the sky finally broke open into soft gold. I drove to the waterfront and walked along the pier, letting the cool breeze sweep past me. The waves hit the shore in slow, rhythmic curls, as if reminding me that time keeps moving, whether people grow with it or get left behind. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. I realized something simple and piercing. The family I spent my whole life trying to earn had never been mine. But the woman I was becoming, steady, clear-minded, unwilling to disappear again. She was mine. Entirely. Family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when the truth cracks everything open. It's about who stands beside you, not because they have to, but because they choose to. I had lost the illusion of family I clung to for years, but I'd gained something far stronger: self-respect, truth, and a future that belonged to me. As I headed back home, the horizon stretching wide and bright, I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I wasn't asking for a seat at their table. I was finally choosing myself. And just when I thought the week had finally grown still, something unexpected happened. When I turned into my driveway, a single envelope sat on my porch. No return address, no markings. Just my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. I froze, the air tightening around me, because there was only one person who wrote my name like that.